Welcome to Law Talk, the Legal Scholarship Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Oman, Assistant Professor at William & Mary Law School. You can find Law Talk online at www.concurringopinions.com. Just look on the left side of the page under the Categories heading and click on Law Talk. There you can find past episodes as well as information on how to subscribe.
Today's edition of Law Talk is unique in two respects. First, I'm obviously not Nate Oman, your usual host. I'm instead Dave Hoffman, a law professor at Temple University's Beasley School of Law, and with Nate, a blogger at Concurring Opinions. Today's guest is distinct as well. George R.R. Martin is not a law professor, but instead a best-selling author of fantasy books, including the renowned multi-volume work, A Song of Ice and Fire. The most recent book in that series, A Feast for Crows, was a New York Times #1 bestseller. Martin is currently hard at work at the series' next book, A Dance for Dragons. George joined me today to talk about the relationship of fantasy to law, a topic I've recently blogged about several times. Along the way, we also talked about the laws of inheritance, copyright and fan fiction, how to keep control over your work when it is filmed, the remedies for breach of contract of sale in a magical world, and why most fantasy books seem to be set in England around the year 1400. I hope you enjoy it.
Okay, well, let's get started. In some interviews, you've suggested, or other people have suggested, that your series is fantasy for folks who don't like fantasy. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, that's a marketing slogan, but there's a certain element of truth to that. I do get a number of fans who write me and say that they've enjoyed my books, but they're not normally fantasy readers. One of the things I attempted to do when I started A Song of Ice and Fire, these many years ago, was to give it as much the flavor of historical fiction as of fantasy. And I think, to the extent that I've succeeded in that, the books are attracting some people who normally prefer historical fiction to fantasy for whatever reason. I also wanted to make it a little grittier and more realistic than a lot of the fantasy that was out there at the time.
It seems like in order to make that happen, you do an immense amount of historical research. And the way I think you've described it is you create a couple bookshelves of information, you try to soak it all up, and instead of working it in kind of like a...
Yeah, it's sitting behind me right now, my research bookshelf, and it's got numerous shelves full of largely popular histories of the Middle Ages and associated periods. And
have you been tempted to go the Tolkien route of creating a huge appendix after the fact?
Well, we do have a concordance coming out that will be published separately in appendix in the back of the book, but we're working on a book called The World of Ice and Fire, which will have a lot of the historical background and information in it, and a lot of beautiful artwork and so forth and so on. So a lot of background will get out that way. It's amazing how many fans and readers are interested in that sort of stuff. I think maybe Tolkien set a template there with that, as he did for so many other things.
Or maybe they're just sort of interested about the stories behind the story. I mean, I guess the story that I'm interested in, which is a little bit embarrassing, is I'm interested in the legal story behind the story. So how much of that bookshelf is law, if any?
Very little of it is law, actually. Law comes into the general histories of the time and underlies some of the conflicts that took place, but I don't actually have any separate books on medieval law. Maybe I should. I'm not even aware that they exist. I have general books like that include sections about law as one chapter or things within a chapter. But if there is a specialized book about law, it's not one that I'm unaware of, or it's something that's too esoteric. I tend to use predominantly popular histories. Admittedly, those are less detailed and probably less accurate than the really scholarly histories, but I'm looking to tell a story here, and hopefully an entertaining and engrossing story. I'm not looking to do a study of socioeconomic systems or legal systems or any of these things. So the really scholarly works with copious footnotes and things like that are less useful to me in some ways.
Yeah, I imagine that's right, although I also imagine that someone somewhere listening to this will have spent his entire life doing the law of medieval England will feel very sad right now. But that's not me, fortunately. I guess one thing, as I was rereading the books a little bit, just in preparation for this interview, which was in comparison with our modern system where law is hierarchical and controlled by the state, there are lots of different sources of legal authority in your world. So executions come in private and public forms. You know, the public Ned Stark execution, the semi-public Karstark, and the Night Watchman who's killed in the beginning of the first book, and then very private executions by private parties.
Well, there's some are executions and some are murders.
What's the difference?
One has to make a distinction. When Ned Stark executes the deserter at the beginning of the book, he is acting under proper legal authority as the Lord of Winterfell.
How about when Catelyn Stark?
He's acting in the king's name. He even says that in a little speech he gives.
Right.
In the name of Robert of House Baratheon, the first of his name, etc., by the hand of Eddard Stark. There's a concept which is touched on briefly in the books of what the difference between a lord and a knight. There's a hierarchical feudal system in my world, just as there was in real medieval England and medieval Europe, but it's not exactly the same. I made a certain number of changes, in some ways simplifications, because as complex as Westeros and Seven Kingdoms are, they are nowhere near as complex as what you actually got in the real Middle Ages, where you need the scholarly books just to understand the relationships between some of the lords and their vassals and their lieges and etc. It got extremely complex, particularly the later you got into the period.
Right.
So I don't have like the 17 titles of Baron, Earl, Duke,
but you do have the heraldry,
etc. All of which had, in the real world had different ranks. I just have lords and knights, and someone has asked me what is the difference between them. Well, one of the differences is the lord has what's called the power of pit and gallows.
Mm-hmm.
That is, a lord has the power to punish, to administer criminal law on his own authority without having to go to someone else. While a knight, even a landed knight who has very extensive estates, and in some ways some of the big landed knights may have larger estates than some of the smaller lords, but the knight does not have the power of pit and gallows. And pit and gallows, of course, gallows is the ability to execute someone. Pit is the ability to confine them in a dungeon or something like that.
But you use the word power. I mean, there are lots of folks who do execute people in the books who are not lords, and so I guess what you're saying is just a legitimate power, right?
Yes, the legal power.
The legal power.
I mean,
and where does it come from?
Going on in much of the books too.
Right.
So.
And multiple sort of halfway legitimate kings. Where does the power come from in your world? Like, where does the sovereignty arise?
Well, as with medieval England, there's a sense that the authority derives from the king, and the king's authority arrives from God.
Is that why the church is able to arrest the queen for, I think it's adultery, at the end of A Feast for Crows?
Well, the church is a whole other issue. We're sort of getting into a side issue here, the faith, as I call them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, something that sort of, in the U.S., there's always this...
Part of before we get to church, let me say a little more about the lords.
Okay.
One of the things you have to keep in mind is the history of the Seven Kingdoms.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that although at the time of the books it is one single realm, in the past it has been many different realms. It has been seven kingdoms who really were separate kingdoms at the time of Aegon's conquest. And if you go back before that, it's many more than seven. It's hundreds of kingdoms, hundreds of tiny kingdoms. So some of these High Lords in particular were kings in their own right. at a certain point, and they're still very powerful lords. So you do get also some regional differences would be inevitable, and some of the kings, particularly the kings who had never been conquered, never been forced to surrender, the lords who could trace their lineage back to ancient kings who predate the Targaryen conquest by thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
They might have traditions and rights that are a little bit at variance with what a more centralized regime would have, because at one time there's this lingering tradition that they were their own authority. They were the ones anointed by God or the gods.
Right.
In the case of Westeros.
Right.
Now, the church law comes from the faith of the Seven was an Andal faith. They're the second of the human invaders who moved into the Seven Kingdoms, or whatever you call them if you go back thousands of years when there were hundreds of kingdoms. And they had these seven gods, and they're probably the most organized and dominant religion in the continent of Westeros, and the one that most resembles the medieval Catholic Church. And they did have their own courts, and they did have their own systems of justice and punishment for sins or transgressions. And of course, they were more powerful before the conquest. Before the conquest, you had seven kingdoms, but only one faith, and only one high septon, even though there were seven kings, which gave them a lot of influence. And they also had a fighting arm, and was much more powerful in the days before the Targaryen conquest, when there was one high septon, but numerous smaller kings. The Targaryen conquest, when the Seven Kingdoms were largely unified, was followed by a period of conflict between state and church, in which the power of the church was essentially broken by a succession of Targaryen kings, and their rights to do some of these things were diminished. So by the time the present series opens, A Song of Ice and Fire, the church is still influential, but it's no longer the power that it was 300 years before. Of course, you see that changing during the course of the books as a result of some of the events of the books. A series of new high septons come to power, and the one that you see coming to power in A Feast for Crows is very determined to restore the power of the church.
Right.
In some senses, he's equal to a reforming pope.
Right. With the faith militant, who is their military arm that they then sort of gain the power to have.
Which, gives them swords to back up the decrees and essentially restores
the reason why I found it
as a player in the Game of Thrones.
Right. The reason why I found it so interesting was, an ongoing issue in current political debates in the country is sort of the degree to which the executive can be held to account in the civil court system, and the trial of Cersei, the queen, by the civil court system in the church, I thought was something which, today we had an analog, right, with the President Clinton being sued for sexual harassment, and the Supreme Court saying it was not going to distract his presidency. The question I had was sort of, did you have in mind any of that?
I suppose is the trials of people like Anne Boleyn,
right?
Catherine Howard in Tudor England.
Were they tried in church court, or were they tried in the king's court system? I have no idea.
Well, that's interesting too, because both of them were tried and executed during a period of change where, the king had recently assumed, had driven the Pope and his representatives out of England, and
right.
appointed himself the head of the Church of England. He wasn't able to get the result. When he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, he did take it to the church, and he tried to work with Cardinal Wolsey, and a special emissary was sent from Rome to hear the divorce case, but he didn't get the verdict that he wanted.
Right.
And at that point, he said, "Well, I'll make my own up."
Is that the sort of the historical period? I thought the historical period you had in mind was maybe a little bit earlier than Henry VIII.
Largely, it is, yes, but on the other hand, it's not one for one. I'm not just taking any particular event or war or character from history and filing off the serial numbers and
Right.
dating it. I'm
Well,
mixing and matching a number of things. I've drawn, the Wars of the Roses, that people pointed out is certainly an important influence on my book. I've also looked at things like the Crusades, the Albigensian Crusade, the Crusades in the Middle East, the 100 Years' War, which was fascinating.
are there lawyers in your books that just are off in the wings of the stage that haven't yet appeared?
That's an interesting question. I haven't really considered that until I started reading your those links that you sent to me.
Mm-hmm.
There are certainly laws, but is there a special class of advocates who make their living by interpreting those laws? My inclination is probably not, because a lot of the laws in my books are administered by lords. In some ways, it's a government as much more of men than laws. I mean, we like to say our government in the United States is a government of laws, not men. In some ways, the Seven Kingdoms, I think, is the reverse. There is a basis of a law, but an awful lot depends on who is interpreting it, and who is sitting in the Lord's seat, who is sitting on the Iron Throne, and how they settle these disputes.
Well, those are ultimate questions, but I mean, I think in two places, I think one could have imagined lawyers, and one of them again will be this church trial, because there were church lawyers, in the ecclesiastical church system, there were lawyers who specialized in canon law, and the second one was, at least twice I can think of in the books, they're trials by combat, and I don't really know what the other alternative would be, but I assume it would be trial by jury. That the path that Tyrion did not choose both times, and I was thinking.
Well, he does choose in the first in the second of his two trials. He is being tried. It's not by jury; it's by Lord. There's no jury of his peers, no 12 people that are randomly picked, but there are 3 lords who are sitting on his case and are hearing the evidence.
Right.
And,
Tyrell, I think, is one of them. I don't remember the other two.
Right, well, Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper, is one of them, who was brought in to sort of balance it, because they want a semblance of impartiality. Of course, it's a hopelessly, because his father is in some ways the presiding judge. He's the hand of the king. And his sister, who's also a daughter of the same father, is the chief complainant against it, the one who's accusing him of doing these things. But that does have semblance of his trial, where witnesses are being called forth, people are swearing oaths, people are testifying
right.
Against him and saying what they saw and what they did not saw. At a certain point, though, Tyrion realizes that it's hopeless. He's losing that, so he exercises his option as a lord to request the trial by combat instead.
Which was a bad
choice. When Oberyn says he'll stand for him, he thinks he has a better chance there, and he has gotten off once before in the preceding trial by combat, where he rolled the dice that way, and they came up well for him.
See, I mean, if the books were being written by a law professor, that would have been the moment where the lawyer would have stepped in from the wings. And so...
right. Maybe there's a market there for a brand new hybrid, a series of medieval John Grisham novels.
Don't think that there aren't a lot of law professors who wouldn't like to be writing that exact thing.
It would be sort of interesting.
Interesting is a very nice way to say it.
It's only possible, the medieval John Grisham novel or the approach, if you have a world like mine, which is a relatively low magic world.
Yeah, what does that mean? You mentioned that in an email to me. What does low magic mean?
Low magic, I mean, for fantasy, there has to be some magic in the world. But if you read some fantasies, the magic is omnipresent. Harry Potter is a high magic universe. I mean, they got magic for everything there. They got, every time you turn around, there's a new magic thing that's popping up, a new magic artifact or a magic sword or a spell to solve something. They don't actually, because magic is so omnipresent, you don't have to resolve to mundane ways to like solve a murder mystery. Who murdered Joe? Well, we'll just give him the truth spell, and he'll tell us who murdered Joe. Or we'll just cast this other spell, and it'll open the veil of time, and we'll be able to see who murdered Joe. If those options exist, then it's very difficult to write a traditional John Grisham-type novel or a detective novel or anything like that depends on evidence and all that, because you can use all these magical ways of getting evidence.
It would be hard to plot it anyway, because there would be...
Well, you'd certainly have to work out the limits of magic way beforehand before you
Right.
put anything down there.
But the thing that I think is amazing about your novels is we have no idea what the limits of magic are. I mean, it's sort of been creeping back into the books on the characters and on us at the same time.
In my book, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, yes. I mean, magic is increasing in the world, and but even at its best, it's never going to approach, a Harry Potter kind of level, or the sort of level you get in a lot of the fantasies that are out there these days.
You mean by sort
You're
of...
never going to see a situation where one wizard can, pronounce a spell and wipe out an entire army, that sort of thing.
You'll just have dragons and the Waking Dead.
Yes, and dragons are pretty powerful. I mean, dragons are the nuclear weapons of my world.
Right.
But they're not omnipowerful. I mean, they hit you with flame and burn you to death, and they set gigantic fires, and they're very, very difficult to kill, and they fly, and all of this is pretty potent. But it would be nothing in some of the other fantasy worlds that are out there.
Right. Well, I think just to sort of draw a distinction, it's not that the amount of any particular spell wouldn't be powerful. It's that the amount of magic sort of in daily life will never be that high. That's the distinction between low and high, I guess, that you're drawing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, let me ask you maybe a little bit of a separate question, which is, and this is just a question that matters to me, but probably to no one else in the universe, which is, how do the traders that are all over these books, how do they enforce their agreements? What do they do if, for example, a deal to trade one of the Unsullied, I think that's their name, goes wrong, or the eunuch soldiers? Is there anything other than violence that enforces contracts in your world?
Is there anything other than violence that enforces contracts in the real world?
Well, yes. It's just that violence is a step or two removed, right?
Well, ultimately, the man with the sword is at the back of all our laws.
You sound like a famous law professor, famous in the context of law professing, named Robert Cover. Robert Cover wrote an article called Violence in the Word, in which he said, don't think that because the defendant goes quietly, it's because he's convinced by your interpretation. It's because the guy behind him's got the stick. But at least there's a judge somewhere in the middle. I mean, is there a place where traders can go in your world, or is there not?
They can complain to the lords. I mean, the lords are the judges. It's a medieval system, so it's simpler than ours. It has things in it that we would consider a modern thing would consider unacceptable because of too much power concentrated in one hand or something. But the law, the lord is judge and jury, and the king, of course, is the ultimate judge and jury.
How about the guilds? What
always appeal to the king. You can see, well, the guild regulates. Guilds regulate certain things as relates to their trades and all that.
And they're given power by the king, I assume.
But ultimately, someone who feel he was wronged by the king or by a guild could go to a lord, and someone who feels they were wronged by the lord could go to the king if they could get to them and have the power. It's also a class-based system, so that's another thing you have to realize. There's no concept here of all men are created equal.
Sure.
It's certainly not all men are created equal. I mean, some men are noble, and they have a lot more rights than the peasants.
Is there an equivalent to the Magna Carta?
There's, not a single document that I would give a big name to, but when, in the history of Westeros, and some of this is stuff I haven't fully brought out yet, but the first Targaryen king, Aegon the Dragon, conquered 6 of the 7 kingdoms with his violence with dragons and his armies and so forth. Some of them surrendered peacefully, others fought huge battles and all that. But he and his 2 sons, well, he had a relatively tranquil reign because, he was really a kick-ass warrior, and they were recently subdued. But under his two sons, revolts and rebellions and defiance started becoming a lot more common. And it was not till his grandson, or to the fourth king of the reign, Jaehaerys, the first Jaehaerys, the old king, the conciliator, he was called.
Mm-hmm.
It's always been in the back of my mind that he was the one who, perhaps not signed the Magna Carta, but he was the one who conciliated the lords and the people of the Seven Kingdoms to the rules of the Targaryen. He guaranteed them certain rights. He drew certain boundaries. He formalized things. He reigned for a very long time, too. He was, as I said, called the Old King. He's the longest reigning king of the Targaryen dynasty, and during that time he was able to reach accommodations and sort of get the system working in.
Right. So, well, it wouldn't sort of be quite as formal. There's been some sort of settlement of the lord-to-lord problems that would have arisen otherwise, I guess.
Yes, but there's still problems there.
Right.
There's still problems, as there were in actual medieval history. The whole question of the overmighty subject, as some kings referred to it as. Now, in real history, the kings centralized power over the years. The lords became less and less powerful, and the central authority, represented by the king and his ministers, became progressively more and more powerful. I mean, if you look at someone like Louis XIV, France, by the time you get to him, he has these lords who are the own gigantic lands and are fabulously wealthy, but they don't spend any time at their castles,
right,
being sort of a king in their own right and ruling their domains. They spend all their time in Paris at Louis's court. He's reduced these mighty lords, who are people whose ancestors were mighty lords, to courtiers.
Right.
And now they're competing for who will have the right to buckle the king's shoe.
Right.
It's a great honor. The king let me buckle his shoe.
He co-opted them.
Westeros is not at that point. None of my lords would consider it a great honor to buckle anyone's goddamn shoe.
Right. So here's maybe a little bit of a different question. Why is it that almost all of the sort of the fantasy novels are medieval? I mean, frankly, within some sort of range. Is that a Tolkien thing, or is it the most natural period of time for magic to have ever existed? Why not? I don't know. Roman period fantasy novel. I mean, they do exist, but it's not.
Well, this is a question a lot of fantasy writers and critics have asked over the years. You're not the first one to ask this, and ultimately, I mean, not only is it medieval, it's specifically Western medieval. It's specifically Western Europe, roughly from the Dark Ages through the High Middle Ages.
Right.
By the time you start getting into Renaissance, less so, and certainly not much of the later periods. It's not universal. People have tried to do other things. People have tried to do fantasies that are roughly based on Chinese or Japanese medieval periods, giving them that particular flavor. People have done Renaissance analogs, even later things where people have muskets and blunderbusses and big pistols, Three Musketeers kind of stuff in a fantasy setting.
Right.
So all of this stuff has been done, and some of it has been done quite well. But the one thing that, of course, publishers have not failed to notice, and writers have not noticed either, is none of these other things sell nearly as well as the medieval period. So it's ultimately the readers who make this determination, because, of course, every writer wants, he wants to make great art, but he also wants to have many, many, many readers who will be buying his books, so he can...
You got a theory on why it is?
I don't. I mean, I think our Middle Ages is more interesting to our readership than the Chinese or Japanese Middle Ages, simply because it's our common cultural heritage. We all grow up hearing stories of King Arthur and Robin Hood.
Right.
So we're more interested in King Arthur than we are in the samurai on some very primal level. We're getting stories that are similar to the stories we heard in our childhood. But then that doesn't explain some other things. Like we also hear stories about the Three Musketeers and the Old West and gunslingers and all that. So why don't we have fantasy westerns kind of thing?
Well, Stephen King had some series. I think his Dark Materials. No, not his Dark Materials. That's something else entirely. The Dark Tower series.
Dark Tower, the Gunslinger, the Last Gunslinger.
Yeah, which sort of is that. But I think, you're just generally right that the trope doesn't really speak to folks. I guess maybe that raises a question about your fans generally. You've obviously got a huge fan base, and I've been reading a little bit about them. One question that sort of comes up a bunch of different times is fan fiction, and what do you think about fan fiction?
I'm opposed to fan fiction.
Why?
Well, number one, it's copyright infringement, and it can potentially endanger my copyrights and my trademarks if I were to allow it.
Uh-huh.
But also I think it's yes, maybe it's a gesture of love that they love your characters, that they love your world and all that, but it's not the kind of gesture of love that I really want. And for aspiring writers, and some of these people, it's a wide range of fan fiction writers. Some of them are terrible. Some of them are actually talented writers. And I think for the talented writers, it's particularly tragic because they should be doing their own material.
Right.
I started writing for fanzines back when I was in high school and junior high. Back in Bayonne, New Jersey, I was a comic fan. And comic fandom was just starting then, back in the 60s. They published little amateur dittoed magazines that sold for a quarter. And there were a lot of articles in them about the comic books that we were reading, so you could do nonfiction of that type, or you could draw characters if you were a talented artist. But there was also fiction, and the fiction was of two types. One was the writers who wanted to write about characters in the actual comic books. They wanted to write a Superman story. They wanted to write a Spider-Man story. That didn't get very far. The companies shut them down pretty quickly because they weren't going to let their copyrights been infringed,
Right.
and start publishing amateur Spider-Man stories. So people very quickly switched to writing about their own characters. Now, some of the characters may have certain resemblances to Superman or Spider-Man, but you call them by a different name, and they're not Peter Parker, they're Sam Smith or something like that. You get a different character, and you develop your character, you develop your world, and that's the kind of stuff I started with. I started with a character named Manta Ray, who and since I couldn't write about other people's characters, and I really wouldn't have wanted anyway, I wanted to do my own character, make a character who was great in his own right, who would stand up equal to those, and I wanted to create my own world. And those are important parts of writing. If you're borrowing other people's characters and you're borrowing other people's world, you're never going to learn the things that you need to learn to do successful writing of your own. You got to do the whole kind of thing. Take the training wheels off.
Right. I guess that sort of leads a little bit to sort of what will happen in the future kind of question. In music, right? This has been a real struggle for folks, how to control their own content, how to make sure people don't copy it either directly in file sharing or sampling.
I don't have any answers on this. This is a huge controversial area in SFWA right now.
Right.
And
SFWA is the guild, is the union of writers, right?
Right, the Science Fiction Writers of America.
Right, which I saw that you were a past president of, is that right?
Vice president.
Yeah, past vice president. Are we going to see you on the picket line sometime soon?
I was on the picket line yesterday morning.
Were you?
For the guild, yeah. We were picketing a thing here in Santa Fe. I don't know how it's all going to shake out, but these are very difficult issues with the internet and the ease of copying things, the ease of piracy. What effect is it all going to have? I don't know.
Is that one of the reasons you put up sample chapters to sort of whet people's appetite and reduce the demand?
Sure.
Right.
Some people like that, some people don't. There are writers who will put up the entire book, and they feel that it increases their sales. It's counterintuitive to me. How can you increase your sales if you're already giving it away?
Well, this is like the
people read it online fine, and then they go out and buy it at the store. This is what I'm saying. It's just still a lot that we don't know about how all this is going to work.
This is the Radiohead model, right? Radiohead distributed its songs, and you can pay whatever it is currently distributing its songs. You can pay whatever you want, starting at $0, and it's sort of kind of a grand experiment in a way. But I take it that's not going to be your.
That's not going to be my experiment. I mean, people are still trying things with this.
Right.
Stephen King tried an experiment where he was writing a serial story, and he said, "Send me $1 if you like the chapter. Send me $1." And as long as he got a certain number of dollars, then a month later he would read another chapter. And it started off very well, and he did 5 or 6 chapters, but with every month the amount of dollars fell off, and then it fell below what he said was the kickoff level, or the cutoff level, and he stopped writing them. So.
I know that you're also negotiating, or already have negotiated with HBO to bring the Song of Ice and Fire to TV. Is that right? Have I gotten that right?
They've purchased an option on the material, and they're developing a script. Well, what's happened at the moment?
There haven't been a lot of remarkably successful adaptations of fantasy movies or fantasy books for TV, and I'm thinking about maybe Ursula Le Guin's series, which she was very angry about, if I recall.
She was, yes.
Losing control over the material. Is that the kind of thing that you get worried about, or not?
Well, yes, of course I'm worried about it, but you have to, you pay your money and you take your choice here, or you collect your money and you take your choice. I've worked in Hollywood for 10 years, so I know a little about how it works out there.
Right.
Now, you can insist on control of your material. You can insist on veto power over everything, down to casting and choice of director and script approval. You can insist on all those things.
Right.
J.K. Rowling insisted on all those things. And J.K. Rowling got all those things because there were enough people interested in that. Now, if you're not J.K. Rowling and you insist on all those things, the studios are not going to be interested in it, or less studios will be interested in it, so you'll get less money. Maybe you won't get the sale at all.
Right.
Or alternatively, you cannot insist on anything, and you could just sell them the book, and what they do with it is what they do with it, and you have to live with it. You no longer have approval over anything. You no longer have veto and everything. And those are the two extremes. In between, of course, there's a vast area of shades of gray.
You've written scripts, right?
My solution to it, the best I could determine it, was in that middle section. I wanted... I had ideas about how it could be done and how it could not be done. And I told my agents to try to make a deal happen that would give the best chance of a good result. I thought that it couldn't be a movie. It couldn't be a 2-hour movie. I had, especially when the 4th book hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, of course, I had 20 different people interested in optioning in it for a feature film. But I didn't think it could be a feature film. How do you get all of this into one 2-hour movie? You can't get even a fraction of it. They would have eliminated, to make a coherent story out of it, you have to eliminate 95% of the characters. Well, pick one particular character and say, okay, this is...
As long as you kept in the blood and sex and violence, it probably would have been okay.
Yeah, well, I don't think so. But the blood and sex and violence was the other issue. So, okay, if I rule out feature films because they can't possibly do it, then the next choice is television. Okay, I can do a television miniseries, 26 hours like Shogun or something like that. That sounds appealing. But then you run into a problem with the blood and sex and violence, because ABC, NBC, they're not going to have problems with that. People are still upset about Janet Jackson's nipple, for Christ's sakes. So how are you going to get the content in? You won't. The only answer that seemed to me was cable television. And, Showtime, the Sci-Fi Channel, and particular HBO. HBO was doing the most adult series. They did not balk from sex and violence, as you could tell by shows like The Wire, Rome, Deadwood, and they were doing terrific work. The quality of their work was really high. I mean, Rome was as good a show as ever appeared on television, in my estimation. So that was the way I went. I said, let's try to make a deal with HBO, and let's try to get some really good people on it. And we did. We got David Benioff and D.B. Weiss as writers, and they're both terrific, and they love the books.
If you were going to play
Giving
any
myself what I think is the best chance that if anything is made, and of course the odds are still against that, that it'll come out pretty decently, and maybe even superbly. But it's a crapshoot.
Yeah.
Because they could, they could fire those guys tomorrow and bring in some totally hack writer who, wants to change everything. They could do anything they want. I signed a contract, I took the money, so now I can just hope for a good result as Ursula did, I guess. And that's what happened to Earthsea.
Right. If you were going to play any character in the book, in the HBO movie, which one would it be?
If I could play any character?
Yeah, of course. Well,
I don't actually fit most of the roles.
Peter Jackson got to appear in his movie, as a random guy with a stick somewhere.
Yeah, I'll probably appear in a movie as a random guy. Yeah. I'll work myself in one way or another.
I was thinking if you had someone in mind. I don't know.
And Beauty and the Beast in my old TV show that was on. I'm in 2 episodes of that if you look closely.
Let's see. I think I don't have that many more questions. Oh, I guess this one, which is
a law you haven't touched on, by the way, which I thought I was thinking about beforehand that we might discuss, but it's very important, is inheritance law.
Yep. I was about to sort of ask you about that.
Inheritance law is the basis of so many of the real wars of. The wars of the Roses basically all came down to a question of inheritance. Who had the superior claim?
Right.
If they had a very clear-cut law on that, it might have been easy, but it wasn't. One guy was descended from the second of Edward III's sons, but through a female line, and he was also descended from the fourth. The other contender was descended from the third. So who has the superior claim there?
Who keeps inheritance law?
The whole issue of the 100 Years' War was a question of inheritance.
Right. Who keeps it in Westeros? Who sort of holds that law? Because inheritance sort of has to be in some way superior or separate from the king, because the king can't. The king is dead, I guess.
Well, it's a question of your superior. I mean, the king will rule. If a lord dies and there's a disputed inheritance to his domains, the king would presumably rule on that.
Right.
But the problem, both in the real Middle Ages and in Westeros, is that you don't necessarily have to accept this. If you are a lord and, you and your brother are both saying your father's died and you're both saying you should be the next lord, and you're both popular enough to be able to raise armies, then, no matter what the king may decide, it's going to come down to who wins on the battlefield. Unless, of course, the king has a bigger army than both of you, and you don't rise because you're afraid of the king and his bigger army. So it all comes back to the kind of the stick there.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the short story that was in the Legends collection, I think there was a short story about Duncan Egg traveling and an inheritance issue that was resolved, I guess, at point and sword, right?
Right.
It's sort of a...
As indeed, I mean, the 100 Years' War was 100 years being fought over the Salic law of France and whether the throne of France could pass through the female line. Or only I don't know if you've studied any of these issues or the particular cases that occurred in real life.
Right, I haven't.
But Philip the Fourth of France had had 3 sons and a daughter. And he married his daughter to the King of England. And he had 3 sons, all of whom were married, and 2 of whom had children of their own. But one by one they died. And, it's actually more complicated than that. It gets very complicated and very interesting, I think, the whole question. Philip IV was the king who destroyed the Templars, and they cursed him as they were the last Grand Master of the Templars as he was burning, that him and his line would die out. And indeed, Philip died within a year, and then one by one, his 3 adult sons, who followed him one by one to the throne, each of them died. it was the second son, Philip V, who had actually promulgated the Salic Law, because the first son to die had a daughter. He had no son, but he had a daughter. And the second son wanted to take precedence over that daughter, so he had his scholars find this obscure law that goes all the way back to the Franks and had never actually been enforced in France before that, in modern, well, what was modern at the time, France. Of course, he only lasted like 9 or 10 years, and then the third son briefly reigned and died with only daughters. And then the question is, well, okay, 3 sons are dead, there's no male heir, do we go to a cousin, which was the first Philip of Valois, the first of the Valois dynasty, or do we, the daughter married the King of England, and she has a son, who is now King of England, Edward III. He's the actual grandson of the old king. He's the only one in direct descent, otherwise you're talking cousins. By any law of inheritance that was in Europe at the time, he should have had the superior claim, but the French didn't want an Englishman to take over, so they said, oh no, we have the Salic Law. His claim through a woman, so we can't have that. So they fought for 100 years, and many thousands of people died.
I mean, the thing that I think is interesting about that in your books is I think that's one of the only places that we I guess, sort of really see law constraining people's behavior, constraining the king's behavior, in that, the queen would clearly, Queen Cersei would clearly have wanted to inherit, but she says because she's a woman, she can't. And either because politically that's true or because she feels constrained by the law, it passes on to her son.
Right.
I guess that's right. I guess the other thing I was going to ask was life beyond the wall. It sort of seems lawless, right? Is that a good description of life beyond the wall?
Beyond the wall?
Yeah, beyond the wall. There's sort of a king, but he doesn't quite rule. Well, now there's no king.
Now, the king beyond the wall is really a war leader almost more than anything else. There's no inheritance there in the way we see. First of all, there's a number of different peoples. The people south of the wall, they're all wildlings, but there's actually a number of different peoples there with different societies and different ways of living. But it's a tribal society. But every once in a while, a charismatic leader arises, and if he can cow enough of the people, he becomes king beyond the wall, and then he's usually expected to try to lead an attack against he doesn't settle down to rule, he tries to attack the wall and take it and take the south.
In a way, that's sort of just like the South, right? It's tribal in the South as well, just at a slightly higher level of social organization.
Yes.
This may be the concluding question. People have remarked that the world you've created is a little bit melancholy and dark. And I guess my view is maybe it's melancholy and dark because violence is a solution to most problems, and there's not really much of a civilizing force of laws. And this is, maybe you're just going to tell me read and find out, but is there anything hopeful on the horizon for the people of Westeros in terms of making their world less dark? I know that winter is coming.
Well, yeah, winter is coming. So it'll probably get darker before it gets lighter. However, my work has always had a certain amount of melancholy to it. If you go all the way back to my earliest published stories in the 70s, I think you'll find that trend. It's just something about...
Well, you're a Jets fan, so...
About that, yes, that may be part of it. Yes, we've been cursed ever since Joe Namath. But, fiction is about conflict and is about dark periods. No one goes out and reads the book about the happy, peaceful family living in happy, peaceful times. What is that? You're going to write a fantasy cheaper by the dozen or something? Having adventures. Oh, we burned the chicken. How will I say, father, that I lamed his horse? It's I don't know. Yeah, I suppose people will be entertained by that, but I think certainly ever since Tolkien, and probably even before, there's a dramatic intensity to fantasy that requires a certain amount of darkness.
Apocalypse is what I think of. The apocalypse is always on the horizon.
Now, mine is darker than some ways, I think, because I have tried to make it a little more realistic. I mean, people who complain that my world is too dark, clearly have never read much about the real Middle Ages. I mean, the things that go on in Westeros are nothing compared to some of the things that went on in the real Middle Ages, in terms of rape and torment and slaughter and torture. It was not a happy time in the Middle Ages. The Black Death, I haven't even gotten into the Black Death yet. That was a fun time. But I did want to do more than, I see, not so much these days, actually, because I think there is a realistic movement going on in fantasy. But if you go back to the 70s and the 80s, a lot of the fantasies that were being published then that were very popular were set in sort of a Disney Middle Ages, a Ren Fair Middle Ages, where, you had kings and you had lords, and they were fighting with swords and stuff, but castles were all very clean, and it was Disneyland, it was they had all the titles, but they didn't have any of the nasty realities of the class system. You'd always get the scene where the spunky peasant boy tells off the spoiled princess. That doesn't happen in real. The spunky peasant boy who tells off the spoiled princess soon loses his spunky peasant tongue, and then his spunky peasant head is impaled upon a spike. That's how the class system worked back then.
And then the princess has been violated in every which way, and then she's killed too. Does it make you angry is probably the wrong word, but frustrated that your books are sold next to Disneyland in the same aisle? Do you think that?
No, because there's always, no matter where you are in the bookstore, there's going to be good books with you and there's going to be bad books with you. My books are sold in the same section as Tolkien, and that's high praise indeed. He was one of the most significant authors of the 20th century. And I'm immensely flattered anytime I'm mentioned in the same breath with him. He was an author that I read, of course, when I was young and had a huge, huge impact on me. My work is very different from his work, but I'm pleased to be in the same section as him.
Did you like the movies?
Yes, I did.
After you watch the movies, I've had a problem, maybe you don't have it, but I can no longer read the books in the same way. The visual images from the movies have made it almost impossible for me to enjoy the books. I go back and I read the books.
That's a danger.
Yeah, I go back and I can't have the imagination anymore. It's gone. It's replaced by, images of Liv Tyler.
But isn't that true of any movie that's made into a book?
Yeah.
That's made into a movie, rather? If you pick up Dashiell Hammett's Maltese Falcon,
right,
aren't you going to see Humphrey Bogart?
Right, but the thing that sort of seems sad about it is that so much of Tolkien is your imagination.
Well, you can still enjoy your own version of Tom Bombadil.
Ha! Well, that's totally true. Well, thank you very much, George, for joining us today. It was really fantastic. I'm sure that the readers are going to love it.
Pleasure. So let me know when you get this up, and I will give it a plug on my website.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you spending the time with me today.
Will do. Take care.
Okay.
I'm always interested in your responses to Law Talk. You can email me at nboman@wm.edu. You've been listening to Law Talk, the Legal Scholarship Podcast. Technical support is provided by William and Mary Law School. Our theme music was written and performed by John Schmidt. You can find more of John's work online at www.johnschmidt.com. That's Jon. And you can find Law Talk online at www.concurringopinions.com.